My name is Frank Urena. I'm a principal architect with Oxford Computer Group. And today we are going to be discussing the topic of mastering Microsoft Defender against token theft and adversary-in-the-middle attacks. I will say that the title is a little ambitious because it's hard to master anything in a 1-hour webinar, but we hope some of the high-level information we're going to pass on today and some of the resources, um, some documentation, some links to some learning will help you to get there and master some of the features and capabilities within not only Microsoft Defender. We're also going to be highlighting some of the features in Microsoft Sentinel, that's Microsoft System Information and Events Management solution, and also just within Microsoft Entra ID. And if you're not familiar or aware, Microsoft Entra ID is the identity as a service solution, formerly known as Azure Active Directory. But since last summer, it's Entra ID, so we have been making sure we use the new name. A little bit about our agenda first. Talk about the changing security landscape. Why is this now concerned token theft, adversary-in-the-middle attacks? Why the need to now have solutions or processes in place to protect against those types of attacks. So we'll talk about token theft, what it is, adversary-in-the-middle attacks, some recommendations, and using Microsoft Entra ID and Defender, and then we'll go into a brief demo highlighting a typical attack story for an adversary-in-the-middle attack that features token theft and how to do an investigation and what some of your response will be. I'll also be showing some of the features without Sentinel, without Defender, what you can do to try to detect that type of activity in your environment just using the readily available logs that are in place within Entra ID. If this is your first time with us at Oxford Computer Group webinar, just a brief overview of the company. We have a over 20-year track record in deploying identity and hybrid identity solutions. Many in identity will know Oxford Computer Group as the FIM or MIM guys, Forefront Identity Manager, Microsoft Identity Manager. That certainly has been part of our legacy and our DNA. Started off with implementing Microsoft Identity Manager. Of course, we've since branched out and have done a lot of identity projects around cloud solutions with Microsoft, starting with Azure Active Directory and now Entra ID, integrating that into environments. Been doing very complex identity projects and helping customers migrate from older legacy solutions like ADFS, for example, or third-party solutions to Entra ID. And so we have a long track record in the Microsoft ecosystem, and especially around identity, and more recently, probably within the past 5-7 years, around some of the security workloads and solutions that Microsoft has as part of their arsenal. We are part of the Microsoft Intelligent Security Association as well. That's a Ring of Honor type of status with a select few Microsoft partners who have achieved certain criteria and credentials among our staff to be able to get that recognition. And quickly, just some of our services. We can do planning and assessment solutions, so identity workshop, security workshop, governance, readiness assessments, and security reviews. Of course, deployment services around Entra identity governance as well. Office 365 migrations and integrations, You notice Savient is also part of that. So Savient is one of our other partners in addition to Microsoft. Savient is a leader in the identity governance space as well. Um, and we also have managed services coming out of our managed services group in Costa Rica, so a nearshore resource that can do 24/7 monitoring, alerting, logging, which is kind of relevant to some of the information that we'll be talking about today. All right, so getting into our discussion, we all know in security, nothing stays static, nothing stays the same. As blue teams figure out what red teams, attackers are doing, um, the cat and mouse game continues to go on. And so to that end, these threat actors are evolving. They're changing their tactics. And the reason for this, in the last couple years, we've seen a wider adoption, which is a good thing, of MFA. There was a time, I've been doing webinars and these types of talks for past 6, 7 years. And we started out just trying to encourage people to turn on MFA in their environments, right? 2020 hit, and we saw a big jump in our clients and others that we work with, quickly enabling MFA, even the very basic MFA solution, just to have that extra layer of protection. But it is interesting that at one point Microsoft was seeing signals that only 20% of their customers had MFA turned on, but that figure has certainly jumped up in the past few years, again, which is a good thing. But because of that, that has, of course, meant that these threat actors are going to evolve and change their tactics. So instead of um, stealing passwords, which is has been the traditional way of trying to um, break into an environment, is to steal identity with a credential pair, the username and the password. Now with MFA, of course, that's been harder to do, so they've switched to stealing tokens. And of course, the way we work has changed the past few years. A lot of hybrid work now, in some cases 100% remote work, where users may be accessing corporate resources through unmanaged devices. They're using their personally owned devices, their own mobile devices. Just speaking from our client base alone, we know a lot of our clients have opted to allow a BYOD policy. They no longer want to be responsible for purchasing and owning and caring for throughout 3-5 year life cycle of mobile devices. So they allow their users to access corporate resources using their own devices and hope that the security settings that they have in place are going to be sufficient. But those personally owned devices, of course, introduce a whole new level of risk because corporate IT organizations no longer have complete control over those devices. They can't dictate, what a user is going to run. You can have some criteria, but of course, it's limited. And we know that identity now is the security control plane, right? So many organizations have adopted cloud SaaS applications and single sign-on. Again, those are good things. Having a single strong identity for users, where they no longer have to remember multiple usernames and passwords, which was the leading cause of identity breaches in the past. That's a good thing. Adopting cloud SaaS applications that utilize OAuth and OIDC and SAML. Um, that's a good thing. Having single sign-on is a good thing. But those modern authentication protocols like OAuth and SAML, they rely on tokens with claims to access resources. So protecting those tokens, therefore, is becoming crucial. Making sure that those credentials in the form of those tokens do not get into the wrong hands. Unfortunately, detecting token theft is difficult. The good news is that it seems it is a relatively low incidence of token theft occurring in an environment, in a well-managed environment. But when it does happen, it can lead to, uh, it can be pretty destructive depending on the user and what level of privileges that they had. Um, just last year, there were a number of incidents of token theft that occurred in very large organizations, which led to business email compromise scenarios. And it took, several weeks before it could be detected and found out. Um, so defenders need to ensure that the proper safeguards are in place. Mentioned before, yes, the tokens are the center of the are at the center of identity platforms such as Entra ID, and those resources are protected um, with tokens that are issued by the identity provider, and that's whether you're using Entra ID, whether you're using Okta, whether you're using ADFS, Ping, doesn't matter. Those are identity providers that are utilizing auth2 um, as the authentication protocol and authorization protocol. And so the way it does that is by issuing these tokens. Those tokens contain claims about the user, such as username, their title, groups that they may belong to. And in a typical flow, the user opens a browser, they navigate to that application, they sign into their identity provider, which issues them their token, and they're redirected back to that application with that valid token, which is then consumed. And if it passes, the application um, accepts the token, then they're granted access. Um, and if the user happens to be in a privileged role, so an Entra ID, say a global administrator or another highly privileged user, then that token is going to reflect the fact that they are a privileged user. Now, two of the most common theft techniques that are seen in the wild has been adversary-in-the-middle, which uses frameworks that can introduce infrastructure in between the user uh, and the corporate resource that they want to get access to steal credentials in the form of these tokens. What that looks like, essentially, if we go back to the good old days, hate to say that those were the good old days where traditional credential theft, attacker sends a phishing email to a user, they click on the link, they provide their username and password because the website looks legitimate. Um, their credentials are then compromised. But if the organization had MFA in place, at that point, the attacker is no longer able to do any damage, right? Because MFA is going to block that authentication. And again, as mentioned before, we're seeing nice uptick of MFA being enabled in many of our clients' devices, or I should say environments. And so those traditional credential stealing efforts are no longer working. But now in a adversary-in-the-middle phishing attack, again, same scenario, an adversary sends out phishing email to a user, but now they've introduced um, some type of infrastructure in between that user to spoof, to mimic a Microsoft login page, for instance. They do a really good job of hiding that, of being able to mask uh, where that information is actually going. And at that point, that infrastructure, and we've seen it with the Emotet, Evil Gen X2 is another framework that is utilized in this way, is able to not only steal the credentials, but also steal the token. And the adversary then just has to replay that token. The MFA check is completed because the user still gets a prompt and they input their MFA. And now that token with the MFA check completed is stolen, and the adversary just has to replay it and is granted access to the corporate resource as if they were the user. So of course, the dangers of that, if a user's mailbox or account is stolen, oftentimes we see business email compromise, which can be leveraged for financial gain, to try to get uh, monies diverted for payment to a separate account. We see that a lot. Or worse, if the user happens to be working on the machine where they also use a privileged credential, the token for that privileged credential could also be stolen, which could be catastrophic. It could be complete loss of a tenant. Another similar attack is known as a pass the cookie type of attack. And if you've worked in Active Directory and Kerberos environments, it's very similar to um, an Active Directory pass the hash type of attack, but essentially, as opposed to setting up infrastructure like a reverse proxy in between the user and the legitimate corporate resource, in this case, they're installing malware onto that person's personal device. That user is using a browser session where they may have logged in to check their Gmail account, but they're also checking their corporate resources that's using Enter ID, giving them access to applications, and now they've been able to steal that entire session cookie and gain access to those corporate resources. And what's interesting is in this case, it's very difficult to detect this type of activity. Oftentimes, again, it's happening on a personally owned device, a device that may not be Enter ID joined or hybrid Enter ID joined or even Enter registered. And so, being able to um, use policies or have prevention of that, it has to take a different route. It's different mitigation strategies that must be taken in order to prevent that. So some recommendations that we've seen, and this again, this is from our own experience and from published information, is number one, we want to encourage customers to enforce restrictions to critical resources, meaning if possible, make sure that access to critical resources such as Exchange Online, SharePoint, uh, your human resources capital management solution, financial applications, those type of applications that could be very damaging if they're breached, that access to those applications is only coming from known devices that are known to the organizations. And that means they're Entra ID joined, hybrid Entra ID joined if you still have an Active Directory environment and you're doing that. And at minimum, Entra registered and registered devices in order to gain access to those applications. Um, Utilize compliance tools like an MDM solution. So in Microsoft ecosystem, that of course is going to be Intune. Intune is very tightly integrated with the rest of the Microsoft Cloud security cloud solutions, um, and speaks directly and shares information with Defender for endpoint, as an example. But this also is true if you're using another solution, another MDM. Use those tools and use conditional contextual-based access policies to limit access to those critical resources, again, only from those known devices. Keep this is obvious, but keep devices patched and up to date and require compliance. So there's with an Entra ID, because it's integrated with Intune. For instance, you can have a compliance policy that says certain criteria has to be met in order for the device to be granted access to resources. You can enforce that compliance, especially when accessing those critical applications. And then MFA is great, but if you're still using SMS or you're still using even with an app like Microsoft Authenticator, if it's still just a simple push notification, start making the move to phishing-resistant MFA solution. Entra ID supports a number of these. Of course, Windows Hello for Business is a great phishing-resistant method for authenticating. It relies on a device, TPM chip that's on the device. In order to grant access, you can use FIDO2 security keys. Um, you can, of course, also start making the move to a passwordless authentication in your environment as well. Um, while passwordless solves one problem, the stealing of credentials, um, again, it's doesn't necessarily solve the problem of token theft, but it is a stepped up uh, security measure that can be taken. So in that way, users, if they do get phished, if they don't know their password, they're immediately cannot proceed, right? So it does help mitigate the potential of what may happen in the case of a user error. Again, that's all good if you have your managed devices, you have Windows 11 in your environment, they're Entra ID joined or hybrid Entra ID joined, you have conditional access policies, you're doing all that. Um, but there's going to be the case of users accessing resources from unmanaged devices. So what can be done there? Well, a couple of suggestions, and this is again from experience. We've implemented some of these within our environment ourselves, and have seen other clients do the same. Um, one thing you can do is using conditional access policies is reduce the lifetime of the session. So by default, a primary refresh token um, is essentially valid for a very long period of time, um, unless you're doing frequent password rotation, password changes. Um, that session can be active for a very long time. And the past few years, recommendation, this is coming from NIST. Uh, we've seen Microsoft adopt these recommendations of uh, not enforcing a password rotation, because at the end of the day, your passwords don't matter. Instead, try to move towards a passwordless environment using phishing-resistant MFA solutions. But in those cases, that primary refresh token can be valid for an indefinite period of time, and the access tokens that it issues will therefore, even though those access tokens expire after 60 minutes or so, they'll continuously get refreshed. Um, you can move to a model where for unmanaged devices, reduce the lifetime. Make sure that, in some cases, if it's a super critical application, some environments require every single time you log in, you have to re-authenticate. You have to go through the process of entering your credentials, satisfying an MFA prompt, for instance. Um, with Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps, which is part of the Microsoft Defender family of solutions, you can also implement policies that restrict what users can do in the application. So, for example, you can have a policy that prevents download of data when they're on an unmanaged device and they are accessing a SharePoint site, or if you've integrated a third-party cloud storage solution like Box or Dropbox, you can also do that with Defender for Cloud Apps, where they can view information, but as soon as they go to try to download any information, they're prevented from accessing that. I have a screenshot here of some of the options available to you within um, conditional access policy. So you notice here you have, I'm just going to point on these, sign-in frequency. So that's where you would can change the sign-in frequency for that session, depending on what other conditions you set. And again, this could be limited to specific applications. It's often not recommended to try to do this across the board because it'll have a very negative effect on the user experience, which could lead to just more error or just frustration on the part of users. But perhaps a select, a few people in finance, people in HR accessing an HR application or finance application would have a sign-in frequency that requires them to log in more frequently. Persistent browser session is another option that's available where that can limit the validity of the browser session. As soon as they close their browser and log back in, it could essentially reset the PRT and have them re-authenticate. And then a new feature that's still in preview, and we'll talk a little bit about it in just a little bit, is token protection. So that's a new feature available in Entra. And since I mentioned it, let me switch over there. So token protection, which is currently in public preview in Entra ID, creates a cryptographically secure tie between the token and the device that it's issued to. So essentially, a client secret is created, it's stored in the TPM of that device, and that token can only be used on that registered or Entra ID joined device that the user is using. You can then use a policy to ensure, like the previous screen just showed, I'll flip back there. So in your conditional access policy, if you have that box checked off under session, require token protection, you can then require that the sign-in or refresh token is the only thing that's used by the application when requesting access to a resource. So it has to be that device and that specific token. If token is stolen and there's a device somewhere halfway around the world where the attacker is, and they try to replay that token, it's going to fail. Some details currently in preview. These are your supported devices and apps. So Windows 10 or newer that are Microsoft Entra joined, hybrid joined, or registered. OneDrive sync clients, the Teams native client, Power BI desktop, and Visual Studio 22 when using Windows Authentication Broker. So this token protection is also known as token binding in the industry. It's not a proprietary Microsoft feature or spec. It is spec by the AiTM and consortium that's working on this, but it's now just being added to Entra ID, so it's something to be looked at. But there are some limitations. So one limitation is, if this sounds interesting to you, make sure that you exclude any external users, such as your B2B users that might be in your environment, because their devices are not going to be Entra ID joined or hybrid ID joined, right? So they would immediately fail if there was a policy that was applying to them that they were in scope of, and you had this token protection feature enabled. There are some applications that don't support it, such as PowerShell modules accessing Exchange, SharePoint, or Microsoft Graph that are served by Exchange, the Power Query extension for Excel, extensions in Visual Studio Code, and there's also, right as of writing, that took this directly from the Microsoft Learn documentation above within the Teams 2.1 preview client that is being worked out. So an interesting feature, something to look at. Highly recommend doing it at a very small scale or in a test environment if possible. And note too that from a licensing perspective, this feature is part of Entra ID protection. So because of that, it's going to require Entra ID P2 licenses when it goes GA. So if you're currently an Entra ID P1 environment, you'll see that you have the ability to enable this feature, but once it becomes GA, it will require P2 licenses, so keep that in mind, because it may require you to purchase additional licenses. I wanted to show this too. This is from the standpoint of constructing a conditional access policy here. And I'm trying to zoom in a little bit, make that a little bit better. But one idea for enabling or how you would enable something like this, and this applies to whether it's your sign-in frequency setting, or browser session control, or token protection. You can use a device filter and change the trust type, right? So this is an example where in this conditional access policy, the trust type equals Microsoft Entra joined, and devices that meet that criteria will be excluded from this policy. And in this policy, I would be enabling one of those settings, for sign-in frequency, or the browser set, persistent browser session, or token ID protection. Now that way, again, this is only going to apply to your unmanaged devices, which is really where you want to focus your attention on protecting your assets. Another consideration is making sure you give special consideration to privileged accounts. This is not new. This is something we've been doing for a long time, even before cloud, right? Trying to make sure that our privileged users are segregated. But personally, I still see, and a lot of our clients are still synchronizing from on-premise their privileged users. So users, they may be domain admins or be in other privileged groups. They're synchronizing them into Entra ID, and they're using that account, usually like a -A account, right, an admin account, in the cloud. The recommendation and best practice for that is to segregate those identities. Users that have privileges in the cloud should be using a cloud-only account, should not be using an identity that is synchronized from on-premise. And the reason for that is to reduce the attack surface from on-premise. If their on-premise account gets compromised, and I saw this in one incident, a large hospital system, the user was a domain admin, and they were synced to the cloud. Their account on-premise was first to get compromised, but because it's synced up, they also got access to their M365 environment. And because they were a domain admin, they were also a global admin. So now that attacker had pretty wide berth as what they could do in both environments. So highly encourage to keep those privileged accounts separated and be cloud only. They should also not have any mailboxes attached to them. This reduces the potential for phishing on those accounts. And adopting the use of secure access workstations for accessing administrative portals, highly encouraged. Those secure access workstations should be configured in such a way so that the internet access is limited, and limited only to getting to the necessary portals that an admin would need to get to. They can only log in to those secure access workstations with their privileged credentials, and that way they're not using a personal credential or a non-privileged account to access that secure access workstation, that you don't have the situation where they're browsing to other sites, browsing to their email, and getting access, getting access to potentially damaging URLs and phishing emails. And of course, using just-in-time and least privilege is encouraged. Of course, with Entra ID, if you have an Entra ID P2 entitlement, recommend enabling privileged identity management, or PIM, for all of your privileged users, so that they would need to elevate their privileges when they need to, and provide justification for doing so. And when they're done and the time expires, that account is reverted back to a non-privileged account. I'm just going to check to see if we have any questions in the queue. Okay, nothing yet, so I will continue. All right, so some strategies for detecting token theft with Microsoft Entra and Defender, we'll go into some of things you can do here. Obviously, with the time we have left, can't get into too much detail, but I'm going to provide some links towards the end where you can get a lot more information. I mentioned before that token theft is difficult to detect at certain times, but there are certain indicators of compromise or IOCs that will be triggered, such as impossible travel alerts. So within Entra ID, just looking at the sign-in logs can be enough. Of course, if an environment that has a lot of high volume, it could be difficult. There are ways to filter that um, and look through sign-in logs. We had an incident where we saw a user was successfully logging in from locations in Europe, and they were US based, they weren't in Europe. So that was a clear indicator of compromise. And again, I say they were successful logins. So that's the other important thing. If you're familiar with the Entra ID sign-in logs, it'll show you the location that is being attempted. And in this case, we saw success for places in Europe where the user was not operating out of. And then they were happening at regular sort of 6-hour intervals as well. So apparently it was some sort of bot that was replaying that token and attempting to gain access. Now, Entra ID protection, so that feature of Entra ID P2, Entra ID protection, and Defender for cloud apps, those two, they're tuned to raise alerts for these type of events. So by default, that capability and that integration is turned on. So you don't really have to do anything there if you're using Defender for cloud apps and you're using Entra ID protection. Those alerts are going to be raised as well. But if you have a third-party solution that's looking at, make sure that you're looking for those impossible travel alerts, because that's usually the first sign. Defender for endpoint on Windows 10 and 11 will detect suspicious access to the primary refresh token and associated artifacts. And Defender XDR detection and Entra ID mentioned before are also integrated by default. And those alerts can be tuned. So let me jump to a demo here. And just to quick backstory on this. So the attack story that we're looking at is a typical type of attack that you might see in an environment where a user, named, in this case named Sonia Rogers, was phished, received a phishing email. She clicked on the link on her workstation, and that redirected her to the attacker's proxy, which was impersonating a Microsoft login page, the typical login.microsoftonline.com. Sonia entered her credentials, entered her MFA, or satisfied the MFA prompt. And in that case, once she did that, the attacker now had session cookie and was successfully able to authenticate to a session on the user's behalf to both Office 365 and the Azure portal from a suspicious IP address. Give you a visual representation of kind of what that looks like. So the phishing email was sent. This was the email. She clicked on the link, opened it up, provided her credentials. There was the reverse proxy that was in the middle. So this is your adversary in the middle attack coming from this IP address here. And at this point, the user was compromised. And as the attack continues to evolve and spread throughout, with her session cookie, now they're able to get access to her Entra ID environment. They log in as Sonia. They created an inbox forwarding rule in Daryl's email account, and they created a new container in an Azure storage account. So this was a user that had some privileges in the environment. And at that point, they're uploading a document, a malicious file to a container, a storage container. and now sending that information to other users in the environment. So now another user in this attack scenario, Kelly Gibson, is also compromised. So using tools like, here we're going to, show Sentinel, show Defender XDR on some of these detections. So I immediately, go to the Defender portal. I go to my incidents. I see the incident. So this incident already has a title of attack using AiTM phishing. If I click on the full details here, I can see, of course, some additional information on this particular attack. The activity log is going to provide me with activities created either as part of the automated response or other security practitioners in the environment, and the SOC, for instance, that have been looking at this. So you see things like get IP reputation is from this playbook, where it's showing the malicious IP addresses where the attacker was operating from. The get user risk details shows which users are now at risk because of this incident. And the log is going to contain a lot of information. I do want to give one caveat in this demo environment. There's going to be a few things that are not in sync because some of the data has aged out. It's over 30 days old, but I will be able to talk to it. In this case, the person investigating this incident has a hunch that the user is indeed compromised. So from here, they can run a playbook. This playbook will block the Azure AD user account. Running that will trigger a process to block that user's account from the environment while the investigation continues. And from this point, they can investigate the incident further in Microsoft Defender XDR. So I'm going to switch to that screen here. So now we're in Defender, the Defender console, which if you are a subscriber to Microsoft Defender, part of your licensing entitlement with Microsoft, go to security.microsoft.com, get a nice single pane, single console for all things related to Defender. Of course, you have your incidents and alerts and your advanced threat hunting available here at the top, your assets, your devices and identities, which is collecting information from Defender for Identity. So if you have Defender for Identity deployed in your environment, that's the solution that will look at Active Directory and pick up signals from Active Directory on-prem and forward them to the Defender in the cloud, in this cloud console here, in addition to your devices. Your identities dashboard, again, will give you some really nice high-level information. A centralized view on critical assets, so it tells you all about your cloud users, how many on-prem users, what your hybrid users are, how many global admins, what your privileged accounts are, and any related incidents to that. So a lot of nice information within this single console here. Defender for O365, again, is all listed here in the email and collaboration. And then Defender for Cloud Apps has all of its activity related here as well. But let's go back to our incident we were looking at and take a look at this incident in Defender XDR. So the first thing we do is we land at the attack story. It gives us our incident graph. Our incident graph is going to display all of the entities that have been affected by this particular attack that's been taking place. Nice timeline is displayed here to show you, exactly where everything started. So it starts with the suspicious URL being clicked, the users accessing that link in a Zap quarantined email, so on and so forth, right? So it kind of gives you the entire story here. Drilling down into some of these items here. Um, for instance, we can take a closer look at the email entity. So if we select, I'm looking for potentially malicious URL, click was detected. Um, so we will see the email again because Defender, all Defender products are integrated. Um, it will give us further insights into the specific um, uh, the specific entities within the email that caused um, the breach. So it tells us here that Sonia was allowed to access this phishing website. Now, again, this is one of those parts where the data has aged out, but I do have a screen grab. There's the message in Explorer, and that you can view. This is looking at the email message, and then drilling down further, it will show you, um, you know, what the link was, the verdict that Defender gave it, that it was a phishing verdict, a phishing link, um, and even allow you to, to further take a look at the email in greater detail. And in fact, the screenshot here, this is the screenshot. So this refers to this element here, screenshot one, where it takes a screenshot of the page that the user logged into. As you can see in the adversary-in-the-middle attack, they made it look exactly like the login.microsoftonline.com page, which could easily fool a user. So in this case, as part of this investigation, we've already seen that Sonia received the email. Sender was from outside, and it had her click on the link, which phished her credentials in this case. Um, Looking further, we see that not only Sonia was affected, but also her manager. So if we look at go back to our incident graph here. Back out here, we look at Sonia's profile, look at her user details, so we can get some insights into this user. So a lot of information here on the detail page, or the user detail page, but we can see who her manager was, and we can see that her manager also received the email in this particular case, and could also be at risk. So action needs to be taken. And the last thing I want to show you was here. So this is sort of the last stage of the incident, the user compromised an AiTM phishing attack. So if we look at the kill chain, it'll show you that indeed this was from her browser, her Edge browser. She initiated this connection, and it displays the actual URL of that phishing website to confirm that the user was indeed compromised. So everything we've seen here is all about being able to quickly detect the activity. Of course, there's other indicators of compromise, such as suspicious mailbox rule. That's one that we see quite a bit. And again, in the more recent incident, that's a standard operating procedure for an attacker to, once they get a foothold onto the mailbox, they're going to start creating mailbox rules. So here, Defender XDR is showing us that a mailbox rule was in fact created. Get back on there. And again, giving you insights that indeed this mailbox was compromised, and the details of that would show you things like, where the where the emails are being forwarded to, and how that rule was constructed essentially to indicate that. That's here. the detail page. So again, you get that insight, get the time and date stamp for it, when it happened, and showing in the kill chain. So again, there's a lot more detail, a lot more things you can do. Again, you can see in the user's um, timeline here as part of this incident. All of the alerts that were associated with it, and let me take off that filter so you show you all the alerts that were associated with this particular attack, and again, give you nice rich information to be able to help you detect and then also respond, because a lot of these a lot of these screens, you saw it before in the Sentinel screen where you can disable the user, but you can also do that by looking at the user's page. If you go to that user's page, you have some ability to do some controls from here as well. For instance, disable the user in AD. So if you need to disable their on-premise AD account because Defender for Identity is enabled here, and there's an action account that's been configured to be able to trigger a disablement of that user's account in the environment. There's also the ability to isolate their device, right? So you want to do a network isolation of their device. That all can be done from the incident incident graph here as well. If we look at the device details, we can get that information. Here we already see the device isolation by manual device action was completed, but that's where you would do that. Go into the device page and being able to execute that device isolation process right within Defender, the Defender console. You don't have to jump to a different console. So those were some of the things we wanted to share with everyone today. Let me just go back to the end of our presentation. Some learning resources. A lot of the information for this session was taken from Microsoft Security blogs. Encourage everyone to bookmark that, keep up to date with what the Microsoft incident response teams are seeing. They're seeing a lot of activity, especially from nation state actors. And if the token theft playbook, so there's a token theft playbook that's going to walk you through, help your security teams know exactly how to perform an investigation and respond to an incident, and some training on becoming a Microsoft 365 Defender Ninja. A lot of good information and resources there. And these are all free resources as well, so that's a nice thing. And Sentinel as well, some training on Sentinel. And if you'd like to learn a little bit more about that token protection setting, that public preview setting, you can visit that URL there. The documentation is provided. This is how you can contact us. If you already have a relationship with us, contact your account manager, and we'll be happy to talk to you about any of our services, any of the information we discussed here today. And we will see you next month. Next month, we do have a series on these. So next month in February, my colleague Tim Watson will be talking about how to prevent, identity theft from misconfigured complex federated identity environments. And in March, we'll be having a series specifically focused on Sentinel as well. So we hope to see you there. Otherwise, everyone have a great day.